So this is a topic that I've really wanted to get to for a really long time. Technically, it's part two of something I talked about a long time ago, but I just never really got to it because we always had pressing stories. But now's a really great time because we have some time to just chat about this particular thing. So I had a segment earlier in the show. I literally do not remember how long ago it was, but it was a long time ago, called How Economists Perceive a Property. And in that segment, I talked about the many types of capital, how they interplay, how they are typically valued in a standard capitalist economy, and especially in the American capitalist economy. But I want to do the part two of that, and I'm not going to talk about the different types of capital in this particular segment. Instead, I'm going to talk about property in general. So economists and socialists conceive of property in three ways. You have public property, you have private property, and you have personal property. Okay, and the distinction between private and personal property is actually the most important one, because oftentimes the distinction or lack thereof between the distinction is oftentimes lacking between personal and private property when this is being talked about in the zeitgeist, and especially when there is fear mongering going on about socialism and socialist policies. Oftentimes it is intentionally left out that there's a difference between personal property and private property. So let's define all three first, and then I want to talk a little bit more about the difference between private property and personal property, and why it's such a and why there's so much propaganda out there about private property versus personal property, and how they're intentionally being intermingled to confuse people about what socialism is and about what privacy relations are in certain economies. Okay, so public property is more or less what it sounds like. Think of things that are collectively owned by large groups of people. So, a worker co-op is technically public property, but in a slightly different way. You have any government property is obviously public property, right? Public schools, public roads, public bridges, and public libraries. Anything you can think of that is owned by your community or by your government or even by your fellow workers or what have you. This is public property. It belongs to a set of individuals or a community of individuals, whether that's a union or a township or a government or of some other kind or what have you. And oftentimes, when we talk about public property, we think of it in terms of things that are local, but public property is also, not in terms of what's local, but in terms of what's large, right? But also public property refers to anything that is divided down. So not only is our public roads and bridges and things like that public property, but like everything that's used to maintain them and work with them and work on them and what have you is public property. So like the desks in your child's school are public property. The big blue mailboxes that are around the city, that's public property. Your fire hydrant, public property. Sometimes your mailbox is public property. It just depends. Post office vehicles, postal service vehicles are public property. Everything that the military uses is public property, right? So just and this goes from like fighter jets to pens, right? It's all public property. It's owned and paid for by the community that it makes up. So in the case of the military, obviously it's the entire country. In the case of a fire hydrant, it's probably your township or your city or your county, right? So just a sense of what public property is. This type of property is private property. Now, private property is a very specific thing. It is ownership of the means of production. So if you're not familiar with that term, the means of production essentially are the apparatuses that allow for the economy to function. So big businesses, factories, shipyards, any kind of industrial building, and that includes office buildings, right? So, but it's not just physical things, right? It can be fake isn't really the right word. It can be intangible things like a corporation or a a certain or a contract, or even an app, right? It can be lots of things. It's essentially the things that people work at to generate revenue to move the economy forward. Those are the means of production. And private property is when when the means of production are controlled by a small number or an individual person. So this applies slightly less to small businesses, but it does actually apply. So every small business is private property. It's owned by either the individual or individuals that founded it that own it, right? And when we think about this in the corporate sense, and especially with public corporations, it can be a little hard to figure out who owns it. But oftentimes, it's the people who are large shareholders. Now, individual mom and pop shareholders, sure, they are owners, but they're not owners that can do anything, right? So when we say people who own, I don't mean like any level of ownership. I mean ownership in a sense that you can actually guide the means of production to do certain things in your interest, right? So a person who has 5 shares of Google, they're not an owner of the means of production, right? But the board of Alphabet, they are the owners of the means of production, right? In the case of Google. And Mark Zuckerberg is the owner of the means of production of Facebook, right? He has a majority share. Elon Musk. So these billionaires are the owners of private property. They own private property. They can make the means of production do things for them, and can force them to act in certain ways. And it's not a coincidence that you are almost always a rich person or a person of significant means, with some exceptions, like in small businesses sometimes, if you are an owner of the means of production. So typically speaking, so private property in general, just from a large state, is any ownership of the means of production. And the means of production typically means the large movers of industry that can fundamentally change and shape the economy. Small businesses are a little bit of a fuzzy subject because they are technically private property owners, but it would be difficult to say they own the means of production. But they kind of do, in the sense that they own the means of that small level production, but they're not going to fundamentally alter the way the economy as a whole functions, right? So when I talk about private property owners and the functional changing of and altering of the means of production, think about large industrial players who can actually alter the entire economic landscape, right? And small businesses just wouldn't fit in there. So now we get to our last point, which is personal property. Now, personal property is, so stop watching this video and just look around to your left, to your right. And everything that you can see, with some exceptions, is personal property. It's things that you've bought or were gifted or what have you, that you as an individual own. And they're not economic items per se. They're yours, right? They're your COVID mask, or a painting, or a picture frame, or a bag of flour, right? These are personal property, things that you own individually that are not economic items. And this doesn't just have to be small things, right? This can be, if you're a homeowner, your home. If you have a car, your car. If you have a lawnmower, your lawnmower, right? Just snowblower or whatever, right? Like anything that you bought, you own, that you bought with the money that you have toiled for at your job where you make a wage, that is all personal property. You own that. So the reason, see, oftentimes when private property is talked about, especially in a socialist corner, we talk about confiscating private property. And this is especially true in the large industrial cases where we were talking about earlier, because socialists primarily, our goal, regardless of what type of socialist you are or any farther left you want to be, is to change who owns the means of production, right? Is to make it so that the workers, the people who actually generate the revenue and the profits for the business, actually own the business, right? That wealth is not extracted from workers and given to people who do less work or do no work, right? So, not extracted and given to board members who don't do anything, or CEOs who make way more money than they should. And that, right? So when we talk about private property as socialists, oftentimes the phrase you'll hear is seize private property, or abolish private property. And many fearmongers, especially on the right, but also some misguided centrists, misguided pro-capitalist individuals who wouldn't identify as right-wingers, believe that seize private property means seize personal property. But that's not what socialists are getting at whatsoever, because personal property, your personal property, to a large extent, as long as you don't have like multiple homes or 5 cars or something, or excess, right? As long as you don't live in a truly excessive manner in a way that only really the wealthy could, your personal property doesn't impact the economy, right? It doesn't create an economic effect like private property does. So the disbursement of private property to public communities, or to make all private property public property, doesn't change your status, change the status of your personal property from you. But this is a convenient talking point, because private property and personal property, it can be a little confusing, right? And oftentimes when people think of private versus public, you think of you versus like the state, where, as I've defined here, that's not really how we think of these things economically speaking, and especially as socialists who talk frequently and hopefully well-versedly on property relations. And by the way, who owns what type of property in those 3 types I just gave you are what broadly in the economic world we call property relations, right? Who owns what and why. And so when people are arguing that socialists are going to confiscate all private property, yeah, that's what a lot of socialists want to do. But the reason they're fear-mongering over it is because when they say private property, they want you to think of personal property, because in their minds, there's very little distinction. Or they're intentionally lying to people about what the distinction is. Now, truthfully, there is a strong distinction, and socialists and leftists and just people who are informed should push back on these narratives, because it's important for us to remember that there are these very distinct pieces of the property relations puzzle that we are dealing with. And as long as we can push back on this and educate people on how property relations actually work in real life, in reality, we can actually get rid of some of the fear-mongering about socialism or socialist policies. Because then when a socialist or a communist or whatever says, disperse private property to the public, or abolish private property, what we're talking about is the excess that allows for single individuals to move the economy to their will without check. Whereas if we were saying abolish personal property, it would essentially imply that we were not interested in private property, which is the large movers of the economy, and instead we're only interested in seizing the things that you have bought from with the money that you have toiled under this unjust system. So hopefully this has given you a decent idea of how property relations work, what the means of production are, and I hope this is a succinct and clear follow-up to my last How Economists Perceive of Property segment. And if something else comes up, I will definitely talk about it, but I think this is probably the last of the 2 of them.